Okay, thank you very much. We have a lot of information to get through in a very short period of time, so I'm going to move through this first part very quickly. And again, today we're talking about the origin of the context of the organization requirements of ISO 9001-2015, along with the origin of risk-based thinking, not only where they came from, but also how to implement them. Now, I do want everybody to buckle up because it's going to be a very interesting and unusual presentation in that we're going to be looking at ISO 9000 and its origins in a warts and all point of view. This is not a cheerleading session to sell ISO standards, but instead we're going to be looking at this from the point of view of an ISO user, and it is critical to understand where these requirements came from, to take a skeptical and critical view of that in order to understand how to implement them. So we're going to start first by looking at what I call the secret origin of Annex SL. First, I want to prepare your mind a little. I want you to understand a few things about the publishing world. So, for example, the very famous book Game of Thrones is a book written by an author named George R.R. Martin, and it's published by Bantam Books. That is a fact. It is also a fact that not a single Bantam editor ever wrote A Real Dragon or Conquered the Seven Kingdoms. We know this because dragons don't actually exist. Likewise, Harry Potter, those books, were published in the UK by a publishing organization called Bloomsbury Publishing. It is likewise a fact that Bloomsbury founder Nigel Newton is not really a witch, and the editors of Bloomsbury don't really ride brooms over the English countryside playing Quidditch. This too is a fact. This is because the publishing reality dictates that publishers don't actually do what's in the books. They also don't actually write the books, they publish them. So, bear with me. Here's another fact. ISO 9001 is published by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. It is written by the members of ISO Technical Committee 176, or TC 176. So it's written by TC 176, but ISO only publishes it. So, you know where this is going. Here's a fact. ISO does not actually develop international standards. And I want you to think about that for a second. ISO is not a standards development organization. Now, ISO takes the work of other people and then they publish it. And nevertheless, ISO makes these false claims that it develops the standards. For example, on its website, it says our standards are developed by the people that need them through a consensus process, but it says ISO develops those standards. This is actually and factually untrue. Now, a traditional publishing model has the authors write the book, provide the manuscript to the publisher. The publisher then sells the book and receives the money from the audience, the buying public, and then gives a portion of that money back to the authors. So the authors are paid for their work. That's your traditional publishing model. That's how it works for Harry Potter, for Game of Thrones, and everything else. Now, the ISO publishing model is a little bit differently. The authors give the book to ISO, they get the money from the audience, and then they take money from the authors too. So the authors pay for the privilege of writing the ISO standard, which ISO then publishes and keeps the profits. This is what's called a vanity press. A vanity press is an organization that, if you are a particularly terrible author, for example, you write a science fiction novel and no one's going to publish it because it's horrible, you still have the option of going to a vanity press. And what will happen there is you will pay the publisher for the right for them to print it for you. Now, you can take your books that they give you, and then you can go around and say you're a published author, and the secret is that you won't tell anybody, well, you had to pay for that privilege rather than get paid, right? So Wikipedia tells us that a publishing house, a vanity press, is a publishing house which the authors pay to have their books published. Publication by a vanity press is typically not seen as conferring the same recognition or prestige as a commercial publication. In fact, vanity presses are considered the lowest of the low, the bottom of the barrel within the publishing world. And it says, while a commercial publisher's intended market is the general public, that's who they sell the books to, a vanity press's intended market is the author themselves. So if I go to a vanity press, I am the vanity press's customer. I am buying books so that they'll give them to me, and then I can go around and tell people, look, I'm a published author. Now, TC 176 is comprised of unpaid volunteers. So again, the committee that wrote ISO 9001 is comprised of unpaid volunteers. Those volunteers then write the text of ISO 9001, and they surrender that intellectual property to ISO, and they do so to enhance their personal brand. Worse, through their member bodies, they actually pay ISO for that arrangement. So no one's getting paid, but they actually have to pay ISO for the privilege of writing something and then giving that information for free to ISO. So we'll just take a look at ISO's revenue. So using the 2013 figures, which you can go online and see, it's from their annual report, $23 million was collected in membership fees, and that is the costs that member nations pay in order to send their volunteers to these meetings to draft ISO standards. Almost $9 million was then done in copyright revenue, which means that if one of the member nations, such as in the United States, we have ANSI, for example, if ANSI decides it wants to publish a copy of ISO 9001, it has to pay licensing and copyright fees to ISO for the privilege. And ISO made $9 million that year alone. And then the third largest is the commercial sales. It's the actual selling that ISO does of the standards. So ISO has three revenue sources. The membership fees that the actual members pay for the privilege of giving their intellectual property to ISO. Then if they decide that they want to publish their intellectual property, they have to go ahead and pay a penalty fee back to ISO through licensing and copyright. And then, of course, ISO keeps 100% of all the sales that it makes on its standards bodies for its standards development. How much does ISO spend related to standards development activities? Zero. $0 go back into actual standards development activities. ISO puts nothing into the activities related to standards development. Again, that's because it is not a standards development body. Instead, its expenditures are related to salary and operating expenses, such as paying for the big building in Geneva. Nothing goes back to standards development. All of the costs related to standards development are incurred by the members themselves who, again, volunteer their intellectual property, give it to ISO, ISO publishes it and keeps all that money, and then charges them a fee for that arrangement. This means that literally ISO is the single largest vanity press operation on the planet. And this is a very, very strange situation. ISO is a publishing company, not a standards development, and its sole purpose is to generate revenue through the publishing of books, or as we like to say in publishing, we say pushing paper. ISO pushes paper. That's the only thing that they make money on. We need to understand that because this is all going to tie into Annex SL, context of the organization, and risk-based thinking and how they got into the standard to begin with. Now, if you feel like you're alone in having been duped all this time thinking that ISO is a standards developer, you're kind of not alone because here's some other people that were fooled. General Motors, Honeywell, Coca-Cola, IBM, NASA, National Institute of Standards Technology, the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. House of Representatives, the entire government of the United Kingdom, the World Trade Organization, the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, the UN, and basically everybody on this little blue thing here have all been led to believe that ISO develops standards when in fact all they do is publish them for profit. Now this information is publicly available. This is something you can just simply go on the ISO website itself to check. Now they're going to use some marketing spin to hide some of the details, but it's all there. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is simple fact. Now, ISO borrowed the Vanity Press model for content, but then it took on an additional role of traditional press model for sales. So not only does it take the revenue from its authors, but it also pursues book sales. Now normally, a Vanity Press doesn't really care about sales. The author will come to the Vanity Press and say, I want to buy 6,000 copies of this book. And then the Vanity Press publishes 6,000 copies, and that author has to pay for those 6,000 copies, and that's it. Sometimes the Vanity Presses will have little distribution networks to try to boost sales, but they usually don't go very far. ISO, on the other hand, wants to, since it is retaining 100% of the sales revenue, it's not handing these documents over to the authors and letting them sell them for profit. It is selling them and licensing them. It has to maximize its book sales. So this is where things get a little bit weird in that it borrows some of the model from the traditional press. To ensure sales, ISO has to control the vanity authors. So normally in a vanity press, the author can be as horrible and terrible as they want, and the vanity publisher will simply publish the book no matter what, spelling errors and everything. But ISO has to control the vanity authors because it wants to maximize those sales since it's keeping that information, those profits for itself. And they do that through an organization they call the Technical Management Board, or the TMB. The TMB is an internal ISO bureaucratic body that oversees all technical committee work and enforces ISO procedures. There are 15 members of the TMB, 15 member nations, and that number is fixed. So it's sort of like the UN Security Council. It cannot go up and it cannot go down. If a member nation decides to leave, ISO can elect to have another nation fill that 15th seat or possibly drop it down to 14. But if you're a 16th nation and you want to participate in the TMB, you are prohibited. You cannot. So it is not a democratic or consensus organization with ISO. It is a fixed management board. It is not intended to develop standards. TMB is not designed to develop standards, and because it's not obligated to follow any rules on consensus. It works solely to further, quote from ISO, ISO's global interests. So the TMB is a management organization inside ISO that oversees the work of the technical committees. It can form or disband technical committees at will, and it aims to ensure that the technical committees work to follow international rules, or ISO rules. For example, if TC-176 one day were taken over by, let's say, Microsoft, and Microsoft began to write into the standard that as a requirement of ISO 9001, every company in the world must use Microsoft Office. The TMB would be the body tasked with ensuring that that didn't happen, because they would say that's a violation of our rules, we can't have a dominance of any single stakeholder. They would be the ones who police that. Likewise, they police the technical committees to make sure that they hold elections, that they conduct their activities fairly, etc., and that no single stakeholder dominates, etc. But the TMB was never designed to actually write standards because they're not comprised of member nations. All the members of the world, all the nations of the world are not invited to participate, and therefore they don't have consensus, they don't have a democratic process, and they can do whatever they like. Now, keep in mind this. Within ISO's publishing world, ISO 9001 is the flagship, and all the other standard sales are traditionally weak. So early on, I would have to say probably in the early 90s, maybe even late 80s, but early 90s we'll say, they realized quickly that ISO 9001 was their top seller. And as I think about it, that would have been the mid-90s. So the other standards that they were developing, which they first noticed was ISO 14000, their sales were weak compared to 9001. So they had to come up with an idea on how to improve the sales of the other standards, and they thought that they could do this by hitching them somehow to ISO 9001. So they invented the meme, an idea that the world desires what's called an integrated management system. And they said to the world, you know what, all these companies out here, they're just not happy with ISO 9001 for quality. They really want a single system that does quality, environmental, and everything. And so for quite a few years, there was a discussion about merging ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 into a single standard. And fortunately, that got nowhere. Now, one of the reasons that got nowhere is that someone in ISO realized it is not going to be a good idea to merge two standards into a single standard when you can sell two standards separately. There's more money to be had if you sell the standards separately. Now, obviously, merging environmental and quality was a bad idea to begin with, but ultimately the decision not to merge them was based on the idea of maximizing the number of documents, of books, that ISO could sell. But they stuck with this idea that the world desires integrated management systems. So what they did was they hide the actual figures, but they insist that this IMSD is popular. In reality, there are probably fewer than 10,000 integrated management systems in the entire world. And I want you to think about that. Now, maybe 10,000 sounds like a lot, but it's not. Consider that in the United States alone, if you compare U.S. Census data, SBA, Small Business Administration data, and other business association data, you see that in the United States alone, we have between 3 to 30 million commercial enterprises just in the United States alone. And if each one of those is a potential ISO standards user, we see that 10,000 is insignificant. Now we maximize that out, or we span that out to how many commercial enterprises do we have in the entire planet? If we have 30 million in the United States alone, and there's some 180 nations, how many do we have in the entire planet? And suddenly this number of 10,000 is dropping rather rapidly. Now we look at, it's not just commercial enterprises that can use ISO standards, but also non-commercial entities like municipalities, fire stations, police stations, hospitals, schools, etc., this number gets more and more statistically irrelevant. So furthermore, ISO ignores the benefits of keeping systems unintegrated. Many companies choose to keep their systems unintegrated, to have their quality systems separate from their environmental system for practical reasons, one of which is cost. ISO ignores that. ISO is insisting that the IMS is a massively popular idea wanted by the world, and they use this to justify various things, as we're going to see, but the sale of multiple standards. So what they decided to do was to hitch every other ISO management system to ISO 9001. They realized, again, the merging standards would reduce the sales. So instead, they said, we're going to link the standards somehow to ISO 9000, and that might work. So they wanted to create a unified high-level structure, or HLS, which would make all the other standards look like ISO 9001. And then they could be sold as, you know what, if you have this one, you might as well go ahead and do the other standard because it's going to be similar, right? And the hope was that ISO 9001 users who were familiar with that might therefore go shopping around to see what other standards ISO has and not be shocked when they found out that they were completely different in structure and format. They might buy them if they looked similar. Now, the high-level structure was supposed to define a common paragraph structure or clause structure so that all the clauses were numbered the same. This included numbering, formatting, things like what type of bullets they were going to use, the numbering, the lettering of the paragraphs, etc., and basically coming up with a general clause structure. It was also going to include some common terminology, but common terms related to standards in general. So words like standard, words like clause, things like that. So common terms that could be shared between these various standards. It would also try to seek to reduce the repetition of similar concepts. So ISO 9001 and 14000 both have a clause on management review. Why not just have one that's written in a way that kind of satisfies both, right? But always the high-level structure was intended only to provide structure, not content. And we can see that because it's right in the name, high-level structure. But it was not supposed to provide content because the HLS was going to be generated by the TMB, not by the technical committees. And the TMB is prohibited from writing standard content. Yeah, except that the TMB decided otherwise. As soon as they got working on a high-level structure, shortly thereafter, the committee that they formed, the Joint Coordinated Task Group, JCTG, they went back to ISO and they asked for an extension of their mandate to start developing a little bit of content. And ISO, of course, granted it to them. So now they had a new mandate. They could do structure and content. Now, if you talk to anybody from the TMB, they'll deny this is happening or this happened. But the extension of mandate is a documented reality. We can find that online as well in the ISO records. And also, of course, all we need to do is look at Annex SL and some of the other TMB documents, and we will see that they are, in fact, creating content. So what they did instead, after they developed this idea of a clause structure, they started coming up with controversial definitions, such as we'll see risk. They adopted their own definitions and then imposed them on the technical committees. They started coming up with mandatory practices and mandatory approaches. So again, the high-level structure quickly deviated from just providing a structure of clauses and bullets and indentations to actual content. And the TMB was very cool with that. But they had crossed a line. The TMB was now developing content outside of international consensus rules. Annex SL was not a voluntary consensus document, and so now ISO 9001 isn't either. Now the hope was that nobody would notice. Well, then I came along and I noticed. Now, what they did was they published this as a document, as we know, called Annex SL. The origin of this is really that the original high-level structure was developed by the TMB in a document called ISO Guide 83. ISO Guide 83, again, was not submitted for international voting. It was submitted for some international polling, but the polling results were non-binding. And, of course, the TMB didn't even have to do that. They canceled Guide 83 at draft, which was a curious move. And they took the text and moved it into a document called the ISO Consolidated Supplement, which is an internal rule. It's one you can find online if you search hard enough, but it's not really released to the public in general. And the ISO Consolidated Supplement is the list of all the rules that are mandatory for technical committees. If you do not follow the Consolidated Supplement, your technical committee can be disbanded by the TMB. So by putting the high-level structure into the annex, which was numbered SL, into the Annex SL, it became mandatory and was not something that any of the TCs could argue. So, what did they come up with? They said, hey, TC-176, renumber your clauses, add risk. And in fact, they told them to add something called positive risk. And then they said, go ahead and add context to the organization. All of this was in Annex SL. And suddenly TC-176 was faced with these mandates. Now, in the meantime, the registrars were under pressure to try to improve their certification scheme because they continually were issuing certificates to companies that were, making products that killed people. And rather than take the blame themselves and say, okay, we need to improve our auditing, we need to be more independent and objective, we need to reduce the amount of consulting we're doing, we need to train our auditors better, they threw it back on the users of the standard and said, you know what? The users of the standard, they don't understand this preventive action. This is the reason. We give a certificate and then airbags blow up and explode people's faces, and it's all due to the fact that the companies don't understand preventive action. So the registrars, who dominate these various committees, they pushed back and they said, by the way, TC-176, you've got to fix preventive action. And then on top of that, the TMB then said, by the way, do it all by September 2015. This was a publishing deadline set again by the publishing organization of ISO. And they were pushing hard on this, and there was nothing that was going to stop them from publishing in September 2015, because ISO does not make money when a standard is in committee. It only makes money when the standard is released for publication and people can buy it. If it's in committee, no one can buy it. So they were going to push this for September 2015 to accomplish all these things, no matter what. Now, of course, I pushed back. The Oxebridge Plan was we appealed to ISO, asking them to please go slow. Next, to consider the feedback of key industries such as automotive and aerospace. We also asked the TC-176 push back on TMB mandates and edit accordingly so that they didn't have to accept these TMB mandates. And they could say, listen, we're not going to do this. We're going to do it this way by invoking their own ISO procedures. And then the nuclear option was that they could go to the WTO. So if TC-176 had stood up for itself, they could have said, we're not going to adopt this Annex SL. We're going to listen to our users, and we're going to take our time and do this right. If the TMB had pushed back, they could have used that three-letter acronym, WTO, and that would have scared the crap out of TMB. But instead, what did TC-176 do? They decided to go fast. Why not? They decided they're going to consider the consultants as the primary stakeholder. Instead of pushing back against the TMB, they were going to grovel. And then when they were challenged about the WTO, they said they didn't know what it was. And when I say this, I literally talked to one of the leaders of the US TAG, the TC-176. He didn't know that the WTO had any kind of influence over ISO. He didn't know what rules I was talking about, and I wasn't even sure he even knew what the WTO was. So no one in TC-176 even knew it was an option to decline to adopt Annex SL. And of course, since the majority of the leaders in TC-176 are consultants that make a lot of money selling services afterwards, seminars and books, and training sessions, etc., it's in their best interest to make this as confusing as possible. So they just went ahead and pushed ahead anyway. And again, for them too, the faster this thing got published, the quicker they can start recouping the money. Now, the risk conundrum was that TMB indicated that you must include risk in some form or another in ISO 9001. But, risk management is really, really hard. And the other problem was that ISO already has a standard on risk management called ISO 31000. And so this was a little weird. Furthermore, they said that adding formal risk management is going to scare away users, and that would reduce sales. So TC-176 said, you know what, if we put in clauses that invoke risk management, our sales are going to go down. And the idea of risk management isn't even universally agreed upon, even within the risk management profession. Different industries have a different view of what risk management is. So what were they going to do? How are they going to inject risk into the standard to comply with this TMB mandate in Annex SL, but satisfy all these problems? So they had to come up with a way to look like they were doing something that looked like something, but they didn't really do anything, but they had to make it look like they did something. So they had their eureka moment, and they came up with something called thinking. Now, thinking doesn't require a documented procedure. It doesn't invoke risk management. It can be done by any idiot with a brain. It can't be proven, so it can't be disproven either. You can spin it as you've always done it, and it's as simple as crossing the street. It satisfies Annex SL, and then it can satisfy the registrars by being sold as preventive action, even when it isn't. And so they came up with risk-based thinking. So risk-based thinking, in context of the organization, were both inserted into ISO 9001 in order to comply with this TMB mandate, and literally they were dreamed up. Risk-based thinking was dreamed up over a single week by a few people offline. In context of the organization, well, nothing was really changed. They just copied and pasted that from the TMB document, Annex SL, and threw it in there. So the amount of work that was done on this literally was hours, just hours, not weeks, not months. If we go online and we see the meetings, for example, you can see, if you go on Google, you'll see the TC-176 plenary sessions in St. Petersburg, in Hong Kong. All the photos of them having parties, drinking free beer, dancing with Chinese fire dancers, all this weird stuff that's going on. Very little work being done at these meetings. And instead, this stuff was dreamed up very, very shortly by a few people in leadership and then pushed down to the members, and they were told, let's buy into this. And of course, they went along and did that. Why does all this matter? Well, keep in mind that ISO 9001-2015 was thus written by a hodgepodge of authors, including the Technical Management Board. It wasn't written by your TC-176. It was written by all these other people. It was pushed by an oppressive printing deadline established to support ISO's main purpose, which is publishing books. TC-176 leadership was weak and conflicted, so it failed to push back. The literal requirements in ISO 9001-2015 don't make any sense. Worse, the clauses appear out of sequence, as we're going to show. Now, the definitions they include are highly controversial. Some requirements are missing entirely, and in fact, the standard would be impossible to audit without tailoring. And on this last note, I want to point out that we just heard last week or so that the chairman of TC207 on ISO 14000 has published an official document complaining about how she's finding that the auditors are not auditing ISO 14000 properly. And she happens to be quoting the clauses on risk. Now, what's ironic about that is she was also the chair of the TMB that wrote wrote the requirements for risk in Annex SL. So it's interesting now, even their own people now, the ones who wrote it, are having to admit now that what they wrote is impossible to audit. So it's not just me. These are actual ISO officials now coming to the conclusion that what they did is not very good. So let's begin now by looking at, first, COTO, the context of the organization, how to implement that. COTO is about understanding your company before you attempt to understand your quality system. And even though this came from the TMB, it's actually a pretty cool requirement. I'm pretty happy it's in there because it's a good idea. I think it's causing a lot of confusion, and perhaps it's a little bit overcooked in the standard, but in the end, it should be helpful if you understand how to navigate through it. This understanding is supposed to lead to a more relevant and thus valuable quality management system. That should be the goal everybody seeks, is that you want your quality management system to be tailored to your organization and to provide value for you and not for anyone else, or not prioritizing anyone else. However, that's not really the reality. Usually you're up against the battle with the auditor, and we'll see how to manage that. The context of the organization clauses are comprised of 4 subclauses. And that's 4.1, understanding the organization in its context, which is a really, really poorly worded clause. It really should be called the issues of concern or issues, because that name basically just restates the title of clause 4 in general. But that's 4.1. The next one is 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Then 4.3, determining the scope of the quality management system. And then 4.4, the quality management system and its processes. This is what a lot of people don't notice, but once I show this to you, it'll become clearly evident. These paragraphs are grossly out of sequence. They're numbered all wrong, and unfortunately, if you're implementing ISO 9001-2015 for the first time, which most companies would do, they're only going to do it once, so your first time is your only time, you will probably follow the sequence of clauses thinking that the authors had intended that to be how you should read this. And in fact, that is typically how you read books. You read it from the beginning to the end. You don't skip around in the middle and then go to the beginning and then go to the end and then back to the beginning. But TC-176 doesn't know that. So they have all the clauses out of sequence. So we have to resequence COTO. And we do that by as follows. First, we're going to move 4.2 up. All right? This is because you need to first understand the interested parties to understand what their issues of concern might be. You can't do 4.1 unless you know who the stakeholders are, right? You can, but it just means that if you do 4.1 first, if you're trying to understand issues of concern, then you move on to your interested parties, you're just going to have to go back and do 4.1 over again. So the proper sequences start with 4.2 and then go to 4.1. Now the next two are also out of sequence. They wanted you to determine your scope of your quality management system and then determine your processes, which is, batshit crazy. So instead, you have to understand your processes first and then scope the quality management system. And this is because many companies elect to keep some processes out of the scope of its quality management system, right? Or it also helps to know how to create the quality system and how to frame it once you know your processes. You really can't do this any other sequence. You have to do this. So we're going to move this around to 4.2 first, then 4.1, then 4.4, then 4.3. Then we're going to go in and we're going to add in 6.1, the actions to address risk and opportunity, which is the risk-based thinking clause. Not really, but that's what we'll call it. And this is, again, why this is in Section 6 is beyond me because it needs to be up front here in Clause 4. But presumably they knew what they were doing. We're going to do it in this sequence, and then we're going to add a clause that's missing entirely called determining the strategic direction. And I call this a ghost clause. This is something that is talked about constantly, but is never actually referred to in the standard as an overt requirement. So this is the sequence of COTO. This is how we're going to do it. And as you see, we're covering both COTO and risk-based thinking at the same time when we do it in this sequence, which makes it kind of elegant and neat, and it also cuts down on labor. So resequencing is permitted, by the way. Okay, the official TMB notice did indicate there's no inherent assumption of sequence or order in which ISO 9000 requirements are to be implemented. There's no inherent demand that all the activities of a specific clause must be done before activities in another clause are started. In other words, you can do this in whatever sequence you like. So you're completely permitted to do this per the ISO TMB. So we come back here. We're going to start with 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. One thing, we mean interested parties, not interesting parties. Interested party means stakeholders. We're not clear why they didn't use the word stakeholder. I understand there was some discussion about using that word stakeholder. One can only presume that there were many vampires within TC 176 who were personally offended by the word stakeholder. It's not something they like. So they decided to make it complicated and call it interested parties. Also keep in mind that ISO charges for its standards based on page count, which is why we moved from a 9-page MIL-Q 9858 standard in the 1950s to a 40-page monstrosity that we have now in ISO 9001. So the more things that they can use multiple words to say where one word would do, they're going to do that because it slowly pads and pads and pads the page count, and then they can charge more money for it. So, in essence, interested party or stakeholder means any organization or person who has an impact on your quality system or product or service, or could be impacted by your quality system or your products and services. So, let's look at that. This is probably going to mean customers, of course, but also your suppliers, your subcontractors, your employees, labor union representatives, your investors, your partners, regulators, product and service end users, the public, and, of course, your registrar. That guy. Yeah, so all of these are interested parties. In each case, these are people or organizations that will have an impact on your quality system or your product and services, or might be impacted by them. There's one thing to say. Let me go back here for a second, though. There's one point to make, is that by bringing these interested parties into the quality system, as interested parties, it doesn't make them part of the quality system, okay? Obviously, your employees are part of your quality system. Your suppliers are an external part of your quality system. But your investors and maybe labor union representatives, the public, they're not inside your quality system, but they're affected by it. This doesn't bring them into that. These people are not suddenly subject to procedures, etc. You're just going to take into consideration their concerns and make that part of your quality system. So, meet the COTO Log. This is a document that we're going to walk through. You can download it at oxbridge.com. It's free. And it is an Excel sheet that walks you through what I call the COTO exercise, going through all those 4.x clauses and through risk-based thinking, all in one spreadsheet. It does so in a good sequence, I think. And it allows you to document all of this stuff. Now, in most cases, there is no requirement in ISO 9000 to have a record or a document of any of this. but you're going to have a difficult time first implementing it and certainly being audited to it if you don't show something. So I'm suggesting you use this log as a way to capture the information for context of the organization, risk-based thinking, but it is not mandatory. I want to make that sure. You don't have to do it this way, but if you're listening to this, then you're probably, hopefully interested. The COTO log, again, can be downloaded for free. And the first tab you will see is one that says, that's called Parties. And this is a really simple tab. All right. All you're going to do is list the interested party in the left-hand column, indicate whether they are internal and external, meaning, of course, your employees are internal and people who don't work for you are external, and then perhaps a reason for inclusion. You don't have to have that either, but I like to put that on there just to get your thinking process going. So, for example, let's look at the second line, the registrar, your certification body. They need to be included because they audit for ISO compliance. So they're kind of concerned with your quality system because they're going to either grant you or deny you ISO certification. You may have an accountant, you may have a direct customer, you may have employees, etc. You may also have, we scroll down a little bit here, we look at product end user, okay? So sometimes you sell to a customer, but that's not the end user. Obviously, if you make baby bottles that explode into flames, then the distributor may be your direct customer, but the end user is the one with the burnt baby, so you're probably going to want to worry about them as well. In the COTO log, there is the one you can download. There's already some standard interested parties. 90% of them are going to be shared between any organization, and you can go in and customize it as you see fit. So once you've done this, you have addressed that first clause, 4.2. We're going to move into 4.1, the issues of concern, which kind of follows up the second half of 4.2, because you're supposed to understand the need and expectations of interested parties. So the first thing you need to do there is, of course, identify them. And now as we go into 4.1, we're going to do two things at once. We're going to start understanding those needs and expectations and turning them into issues of concern. Now, if we move over to the COTO log, the second tab is called the issues list. All right? This gets a little bit more interesting or a little more complicated. Right? The first column, or the second column there, the first column is a line number. The second column is interested party. That is going to pull what you listed in the first tab over through a drop-down list. And then for every interested party, you should indicate at least one issue of concern, but you may have many, as we can see here. So for the attorney, for example, in the first line, is concerned with the company's exposure to litigation. And keep in mind, this is within the constraints of quality. All right, we don't want to get too crazy here. The certification body is concerned with your level of compliance to 9001. Your CPA is concerned with your accounting practices. Your direct customer is concerned with high-quality products, on-time delivery, these kind of things. So you're going to go down this list and you're going to come up with as many issues of concern as you can possibly think of. And I recommend you take your time and throw everything at the wall that sticks. Just put everything on there. You can always take them out later, but try to be as comprehensive as you possibly can. This particular screenshot only shows 30 or so on here, and an average company is going to have a lot more than that. I've just truncated it down to show you what's going on here. And this is an activity that might take a couple days to do. Share this amongst your managers, have them do this, give it out to process owners, etc. But take your time and try to do this. And once you've got those first couple columns figured out, your interested party and your issue of concern, now you've met both clause 4.1 and 4.2. We're going to come back to the other columns here, so just bear with me. Just to give you an idea, though, what we've got here, let's scroll back for a second. You can see moving left to right, we have the interested party, the issue of concern. Then I've got something called bias, which I'll talk about in a minute. Which processes are effective? This is interesting, but you can probably delete this column if you like. But I like to assign everything to a process since this is a process-based quality system. But in many cases, you'll see most of these issues would impact on all processes. But that might be useful. I have it there if you need it. Priority, again, you can delete this if you want, but maybe something requires a little more high priority than others. And then a treatment method, which I think I'll talk about shortly, I hope. And then where the records are. So now we're going to address 4.4, quality management system and its processes. Now this clause is largely a rehash of the old clause 4.1 from ISO 9001-2000, so it's been around for a long time. It's been reworded. In some ways it's a little bit better, in other ways it's a little bit worse, but it is largely the same requirement. And if you recall, process approach requires that you first determine your processes and then assign resources, assign responsibilities and authorities, Determine the sequence and interaction of those processes. Determine your inputs and outputs. Determine process measurement criteria. Measure the process versus the criteria. Take corrective action when things go wrong. And then identify risks and opportunities later. Now, you've all been through this a million times, so we're not going to talk about this right here. So that's it for 4.4. Okay, all of your old process approach stuff applies here. You would inject it there. Next is determining the scope of the quality management system. And here, ISO 9000 has gotten a little bit weird this time around. It's not as simple as it used to be. They give you more flexibility, which of course is just going to add chaos to it. So it's worth spending a little bit of time looking at it. Again, you've already determined your processes, so now you're going to start putting a fence around those to see which are in your quality system or not. So we call that scoping the quality system. The best way to do this is to first analyze the information that you did from your COTO work so far, including stakeholders, their issues of concern, and your processes, right? You're going to want to develop a scope statement, and that should indicate what products and or services fall under the scope of your quality system, and not everything you do needs to fall under the quality system, right? And it should include it should define the excluded clauses as well as justifications, all right? Now, the new standard uses the word, you're allowed to say which clauses are not applicable. There's been a little bit of fuss that this somehow means something different than the old requirement that allowed you to exclude ISO 9 clauses. That's nonsense. It's the same thing. If anything, they've expanded it. You're no longer limited to only one clause where you can exclude clauses. Now you can exclude anything in the standard that doesn't apply to you, but you must justify it. And that's very hard to do. So the reality is you're not going to find too many clauses that you'll be able to exclude, but you are required to put that in your scope statement, all right? So not just which clauses don't apply, but their justifications. I also think that you should consider including as well the locations. So for example, if you have a site that has many different locations, but the quality system is only applicable to one building and a certain address, you would put that address. And perhaps your target customers or markets. You want to try to create the scope statement so that it puts the boundaries around your quality management system so that therefore anything else is outside of it. So you may limit it to certain products, you may limit it to certain services, you may limit it to certain types of contracts, to certain facilities in your organization, to certain processes, etc. That is a complicated subject. It's not something we can talk about quickly here. You can get yourself into trouble by scoping too far, so you need to be careful with that. But however, that is the next step in COTO, determining your scope of the quality management system. That becomes useful later on. Now we're going to jump into 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities, and that means implementing risk-based thinking. The weird thing is this. Again, I told you that the TMB adopted some strange definitions. TC176 struggled with these, but for more or less adopted those in wholesale. But ISO's definition of risk is very strange. It is the effect of uncertainty. And in some cases, it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Other standards, it's different places. But ISO's taken a position that risk is neutral. It can be both positive and negative. This is a very strange definition. There are some who believe this strongly, and they say this has always been the case. There are others that have never heard of this before and think it's absurd. And of course, it also defies the dictionary. Furthermore, that definition of the word risk defies many other industries' definitions, and it even defies ISO's other definitions of the word risk. ISO currently has 40 different definitions of the word risk spread out over 140 different ISO standards. I've got the whole list of those on my website, but for people who don't believe me, and many of those definitions contradict this one. Others are just a reshading of them, but it shows that ISO is unable to even standardize the definition of the word risk. In fact, when I wrote them about it, they actually apologized for the confusion, and it's very rare for ISO to apologize about anything. So they know it's a problem, but they're not fixing it. So instead, what I did was I came up with something I call the uncertainty battery model, and I view uncertainty is neutral, all right? In that if a battery is comprised of two poles, positive and negative, risk is the negative effect of uncertainty, and opportunity is the positive effect of uncertainty. So let's think about that for a minute, right? Uncertainty doesn't care what you think of it, but your perception of that uncertainty will determine whether you think it's good or bad. And if it's bad, it's a risk. If it's good, it's an opportunity. Some people use the word threat for risk. That also works, right? Keep in mind this. You work to mitigate or minimize risk. You work to maximize opportunity. Therefore, you cannot treat them the same. You have to, therefore, redefine the terms risk and opportunity as you see fit. This is something people didn't know they were allowed to do. You are allowed to, within your quality management system, redefine the word as you see fit, even if that contradicts the literal definition provided in ISO 9000, and you're allowed to. In clause 0.1 of ISO 9001-2015, it says, it is not the intent of this international standard to imply the need for the use of specific terminology within the organization. You are allowed to use your own terms. I take that a little further. I say you're even allowed to define them your way. The risk, of course, is that you get so far that you define them and you're no longer meeting the spirit or letter of the requirements. And why not? ISO's redefining everything. They're saying quality management is risk management now. So they're the same thing. If they get to redefine stuff, you get to define things. Just keep in mind, if you get too crazy with your redefinitions, if, for example, you redefine the term quality to mean selling explosive baby bottles for profit, that's probably not going to wash. Right? So try to keep it within the spirit and letter of the standard to the extent that you can. Keeping in mind the risk and opportunity, we go back to the COTO log, the issues list, that second tab in the COTO log. Again, you saw that we had a bias column. I suggested assigning a bias to each of the issues of concern. And basically that is you're trying to identify which of these issues you're going to treat as a risk, which you'll treat as an opportunity, and some of them might be mixed, which we'll talk about in a moment, right? They may have shades of both. For example, I guess we'll talk about it now. I have two theories. I call this the silver lining theory, right? That is where you have a thing that happens, an uncertainty, and the majority of it is really, really bad, but there's a silver lining. There's some benefit that can be gleaned from it. The classic example of this is a hurricane. A hurricane is considered terrible, except it's kind of a good thing for the reconstruction industry. They have to go back in afterwards, so they can treat it as an opportunity to the extent that they can. That does not negate the fact that it's overwhelmingly bad, but that there is a possibility of a slight opportunity to be had within that. So you would want to treat this as two things. You wouldn't treat the hurricane as solely as a risk, but you might also treat it as an opportunity. You would treat those two aspects separately. I then have something I call the monkey's paw model. And if you know the story of the monkey's paw, it's typically some kind of quasi-racist thing where you go into a Chinese store or something and you buy a monkey's paw, and it's told that it can grant you every wish that you want, but the trick is that, of course, it grants it literally. So if you say, I want to be 6 feet tall, you wake up the next morning and you are 6 feet tall, but you are comprised of literally 6 feet. You don't have a body anymore. You're just 6 human feet stacked on top of each other. And then the monkey's paw laughs at you. In that case, you get an opportunity, which is overwhelmingly positive, but there is some negative aspect that you have to treat as a risk. For example, you get a massive contract for the Army, which is going to net you, if you can win it, $2 billion a week, except that it happens to be with the Army of North Korea. So you may want to treat that as a little bit of a risk. So again, depending on the bias, whether it's a risk or an opportunity, you're going to determine a treatment method. Maybe that's a bad word now that I think of it, a bad term. But it's what you're going to do to try to handle that particular risk or opportunity. So in some cases, you're going to see that, if I'm just scanning around here, it says risk register FMEA. Well, that would be for a risk that we've determined we're going to use an FMEA style approach, failure mode effects analysis. But in other cases, we may just do something like increase supplier auditing. We might increase vendor performance oversight. We might just manage the company finances properly, things like that. So there are many different methods of handling each risk and opportunity. And this is important to note because all of the articles that you're going to read and all the seminars you're going to attend, they're pushing a couple tools that the authors happen to, maybe they read a book about it, they're familiar with. Generally, it's going to be SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat analysis, or a PESTLE analysis, and FMEA. And these tools, while they're okay, they do not address the full range of risk and opportunity that you could encounter, and thus they do not address properly ISO 9001. If any consultant starts to talk to you solely about a risk register FMEA, they don't know what they're talking about. Having said that, I'm about to talk about that very thing. Keep in mind, risk treatments should attempt to mitigate the risk. That means prevent it from happening, and if you can't do that, then reduce the damage if it does. Opportunity treatment is the opposite. It should attempt to maximize the opportunity. You're trying to increase the chance of it happening, and if you can't affect it in that way, you're going to increase the benefit when it does happen. These are mirror opposites. You cannot use a single tool for both of these. And I'm stunned at how many articles I read from ASQ publications, Quality Progress, Quality Digest, from TC 176 members who keep regurgitating the idea that you can use an FMEA, a failure mode tool, for both risk and opportunity, when you cannot. You can't use a failure mode tool to manage a positive opportunity. So again, that's why it's important to redefine these words and understand what they mean in a practical sense. Because if you adopt their whack job definitions, you wind up only addressing the risk half of the equation and ignoring the opportunity equation entirely. All right? Now, sometimes you're going to have a mixed uncertainty, right? In which case, you're going to apply the risk mitigation to the negative aspects and the opportunity maximization to the positive aspects. But remember, it's impossible to treat them the same way at the same time. You cannot do it. So, for example, we have a standard called ISO 31010, which is called Risk Management Risk Assessment Techniques, and it offers some 25 or 30 or so different possible techniques. It's a great standard. I recommend you buy it. Those include, let's see here, structured what-if, Delphi, human reliability analysis, toxicological risk assessment, Bayesian, let's see here, Monte Carlos, Markov's, etc. All of these are valuable risk assessment treats for risk, not opportunity, just for risk. All right. But you'll see how many times. Oh, let's see. Here we go. We have other ones that are not listed in ISO 31010. For example, these are common alternative quality management system techniques, which are equally deserving of residing in the realm of risk management. For example, corrective action, or CAPA, preventive action, also part of CAPA, a management review action item. You may take it up at management review. That is an appropriate risk assessment technique. You may increase your internal auditing, increase supplier auditing, increase supplier inspection. You may adjust statistical sampling. You may just decide to monitor only, and you may accept something as is. All of these are acceptable. But how many times in 3110 did they mention FMEA? Only once. It's only mentioned once. So all the articles out there that are going to tell you to use FMEA, and all the auditors and the registrars are going to tell you to use FMEA, they're ignoring this whole host of virtually an unlimited ways that you can manage negative risk. And of course, they're ignoring entirely how you're going to measure positive opportunity. So one thing that we need to understand about FMEA. In the old days, we had tarot cards, which we basically considered now as some form of witchcraft, right? FMEA is the assigning of numbers to the tarot cards. So you take guesses with FMEA, you assign a number, and then suddenly, because you've applied numbers to these guesses, it becomes scientific. But at the core of it, it is still witchcraft. It's a form of divination, like fortune telling. It's just that they've applied some numbers to it to make it look statistical. And it's kind of bogus. But the registrars are going to continue to insist that they want FMEA. Most of your auditors are going to walk in because they don't know anything else. They just go where they know. They're going to spout FMEA. They're not going to know that it's been debunked by mathematicians, that it's just tarot cards with numbers on it. And they're going to say, have you done an FMEA? If you produce a couple FMEAs, they'll check the box and give you your cert, you'll be done. And meanwhile, you won't really have managed any risk or opportunity. Right? So because the auditors are going to demand it, because some of your customers might anyway, let's go ahead and put it in. Let's give them the risk register they want. However, I'm going to tell you to only use it when it's appropriate. So if you remember back in the issues log, some of the risks that we identified on the issues tab, we determined we're going to apply the risk register to. Those would then be carried over here onto this next tab called the risk register. The other ones would not. So not all your risks are going to get on here. Only some will. This is my version of an FMEA of sorts, created trying to reduce the subjectivity of an FMEA into something that can resemble mathematics and science. Keep in mind, all of these things are terrible. This one is probably a little bit less terrible than the others, but it will help you prioritize, and that's ultimately what a risk register is designed to do, to prioritize. Moving left to right, we see again, I've got a column here for process. I like to put that in there. You can take that out if you don't want it, but I like to maybe assign it, and that might help you decide which process owner is going to manage this particular line entry. The next column there, the third column is risk. We're going to indicate the actual risk. So the first one here, we have Poor training leads to quality problems due to human error. Now, most of these risk calculations are, of course, as you're probably aware, probability times consequence or likelihood times severity, these kind of things. And so what I do is I calculate a probability rating, but I try to use 2 factors rather than 1. And of course, normally you just simply guess and you say, I think the probability is a 4 or a 10 or a 16 or an Apple or a Volkswagen, something like that. You just pull something out of the air and you throw it there. I'm using a 0 to 5 scale or a 1 to 5 scale and trying to come up with something, how likely is this thing to occur, but I also take into account, did it happen previously? Some people seem to neglect, they forget it, they don't think about it. We think, that could never happen, and then somebody chimes in and says, yeah, it happened last week. Well, I try to factor in both of those. Alternatively, it may have happened last week, and it's really unlikely to ever happen again, so this kind of calculates that. So we take 2 of these factors, and then the probability rating on the far right there is the average of those 2, all right? And because, of course, this is an Excel sheet, and so there's some calculations that assign each one of these criteria to a number, and you can adjust them as you see fit. We then go over to probability. Looks like we're let's see, consequence. Sorry, we go to consequence, all right? In this case, I've got 6 different criteria to come up with this rather than just, again, coming up blind with one of them. What's the possibility of you losing a contract? What's the possibility for actually a person being harmed, the potential harm to health? That could be the employee or the customer, somebody else. Could it affect your inability to meet a contractual term or requirement? Is there a potential violation of regulations? What would the impact be on your company reputation? And then what is the estimated cost of correction? You calculate those 6 things, and then consequence rating comes up with the average of those. And of course, the risk rating is the, let's see, we can't see it here. The risk rating is the the product of those, probability times consequence. Then what you can do with this COTO log is you can set limits. Over, in this particular one, I think it's got it set at 8. Over a limit of 8, it turns red, and in such cases, it's mandatory. You must come up with some kind of mitigation plan. If it's under that, it's optional, and if it's under a certain score, you don't have to do anything at all. So, we're done, right? No, because we forgot all about the opportunities. Remember, again, opportunities are something that need to be managed as well. So, you must work to maximize your opportunities, which means increase their likelihood of occurring or being encountered, and then increasing the benefit if they are encountered. All right, so we go back to our Issues tab, and we see that a few of these we've highlighted as opportunities. We're then going to enter them onto what I call the Bizarro FMEA, or the Opportunity Register. This is a reverse risk register. It helps ranking opportunities to determine if they are worth pursuing, and it also tracks continual improvement initiatives, which is important for other ISO 9001 clauses. And of course, this is all entirely optional. But this is what it looks like. Hopefully the graphics are a little better. But again, it looks just like the risk register, but it's kind of all backward. You list your opportunity. You then calculate a probability. What is the probability of achieving that opportunity? And then what is the potential benefit? All right, and it takes in a few factors there. Is there potential for new business, potential to expand current business? Could it improve your complying with regulations? Could it improve your internal QMS procedures or processes? Could it improve your company reputation? And what is the potential cost of implementation? Meaning that if it's low, then that's a good thing, right? And then that comes up with an opportunity factor. And then again, you set ranges. An opportunity factor over a certain number would require you to come up with a pursuit plan. What are you going to do to pursue that opportunity? And then things that would be low are probably not worth pursuing, and you can do it optional. And you get to set in the COTO Excel sheet, you get to set those limits where you like. The remaining thing that's left is the strategic direction. Strategic direction's concept is mentioned 5 times in ISO 9001 in the new standard. In clause 0.3.1, again, this introductory clause, but it does indicate that QMS processes should satisfy the strategic direction. Now, in the actual requirements clauses, 4.1 says that you must assess those issues of concern versus the strategic direction. 5.1.1 says the quality policy and quality objectives must align with the strategic direction. 5.2.1 says the quality policy, again, must align with the strategic direction. And 9.3.2 says that during management review, the entire quality system should be assessed against the strategic direction. The weird thing is that nowhere in the standard does it actually require the strategic direction to exist. So some have said this is because the SD is part of the overall management system and not the quality management system. So you may have a company strategic direction, but either way, how do you assess all of these things against the strategic direction if you've never told them to create it? Okay? So a strategic direction should look something like this. It should be forward-thinking. It should probably present a 1-year plan, what you want to accomplish in the next year, perhaps a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or something else like that. It should indicate your corporate goals. These would not necessarily be your objectives. This would be high-end goals. And you want to constrain it to quality-related issues. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe this is just the 5-year plan of the company, and then we're going to use that to interpret it for the quality system, or maybe the quality system has its own strategic direction. One way or the other, it needs to exist in some form because you need to compare it against these other things. So when you're developing the strategic direction, you're going to want to take into account all of those COTO items, the stakeholders or issues of concern. You're going to want to take into account your quality policy and your objectives and develop that. And then I recommend that it be written down and included in the management review minutes or records, what have you, and then revise and update as necessary. Now, some companies like to keep this secret. Maybe they have a strategic direction they don't want the employees to know. That's entirely okay, provided that someone there knows it and is comparing the quality system against it, and be prepared to show it to an external auditor under rules of confidentiality. In the end, however, you're going to have to prepare for the typical auditor battle with ISO 9001-2015, but at a scale you've unlikely seen before. You're going to see poor or no training of certification body auditors. This is because, in essence, they are really not required to have any training. There's a lot of bluster about this, but when you read the rules, they are really not required to be trained, and the certification bodies, the registrars, will take advantage of that to whatever extent they can because they're not going to pay money to train these people. All right? You're going to see poor enforcement of the rules against consulting. So the registrars are going to consult like mad, and that means inventing requirements from thin air. As we know, most auditors are frustrated consultants, and they love to come in and consult, right? We already see them auditing based on personal assumptions, in my experience so far, and they keep pushing FMEA even where it's not appropriate. So again, if you've done my COTO approach, you tick the box on the FMEA, you can show them that you've done it. They'll probably won't even look any further than that. You'll have all these other great things they'll never see, but you've at least checked the box on FMEA. And when the slides aren't enough, of course, there's Surviving ISO 9001-2015, my new book, What Went So Wrong with the World's Foremost Quality Management System Standard and How to Implement It Anyway, which you can buy at www.survivingiso9001.com. If you have any questions, you can always contact me, oxbridge.com.